messed up. Welcome back to my 20-year project, which is a 1996 GMC Sonoma with an L6 engine, T56 transmission, and will be sitting on air ride suspension. I just realized there's a lot of sixes there. Anyway, in this episode, I put together the frame. Well, only partially, not without its challenges. So right now, a lot of the pieces are tack welded, and I'll take you through how I got to this point. This is what I'm doing to square off the frame, and the part of the frame I'm squaring off first is the part that attaches to the existing frame, and then that'll tie into the frame rails that I built in a previous episode. I'm using 3/4 inch MDF. This stuff is flat, and the reason why I'm not using my frame table, actually two things. One is the frame table is not completely flat, and it's not big enough. The distance I need here between the frame rails is 36 3/8. Add in 2 inches on each side, and you're at 40 3/8 from edge to edge. I did check, this edge is flat, so my plan is that this part is going to be flat against the MDF. I marked off 2 inches, and you can see underneath here. So then I, just as another reference, and then I went 38 3/8 because I already have 2 inches. Mark this line, and then another 2 inches on the other side over here. In the middle, between the frame rails, is 1 by 1/8 inch that I got cut at 36 3/8. I think it's slightly long, so I might have to shorten it a little bit, but that's okay. I'm gonna get 2 or 3 pieces of that, equal length. Make sure this is clamped to the MDF, and this will be squared to the frame rails, and tack them in. I think I'll just probably do 2 that are flat there, and then I'll turn it over and do another piece in the middle. So that way it's not going to try to kind of bow or move inwards and outwards. I'll make sure that it is parallel, or perpendicular I should say, to the MDF. So now I have the frame rails almost square, and there's a few things I did off camera. One is I drew center line. You might not be able to see it, but trust me, I drew a center line for this rail, and then I also drew a line that's 1.5 inches away from the outside, because that's what's going to line up with the middle of the existing frame. That's 3-inch square tubing. Other thing I did is determine where I want to do the cross members and the temporary cross members, and there's 2 spots. One, and I even drew it on here, which is about 5 inches away. I just picked that number, and the other one, which is a little bit further back, that's 18 inches, and this is a 36-inch piece, so that's the midway point. Now I am going to be cutting it off at some spot around here. I won't know until I get the rest of the frame rails in a rough position so I can start marking things off. But at least for now, while I'm squaring this off and building the temporary cross members, I figured in the middle would be good, and then I'll pick a point somewhere around here afterwards, once I get these first 2 done. I also drew a center line on here. This will help me make sure that the temporary cross members are also square. Just gives me an extra point to measure off of. So now what I want to do, I got this, I think is in spot place. This is close. I haven't put the second clamp on it yet. I just want to make sure that everything is square. I'm going to do it from the midpoint, or the mid-center line here to, sorry, I'm going to actually do it from the outside edge to the center line over here. Now I know the middle, or in between, I want it to be 36 3/8. I'm adding 2 inches to get to the back side, so that's 38 3/8, plus an inch to get to the center line there. So my measurement should be 39 3/8. So going it, I can't quite get to the 5 inch mark. I'm hitting this clamp and I just don't want to move it because it's close to square, so it's pretty close. And looking over here, I'm at 39 3/8. At the 18-inch mark, I am at right on, dead on, 39 3/8. The first one was like literally hair away. And then I'm just gonna pick a random spot here, close to the edge. Let's come here. Yeah, that's dead on, 39 3/8. So I'm square. I'll just put one more clamp on this back one here just to make sure that it doesn't move on me. Now with the frame rails set, I focused my attention on the temporary cross members. Had to do some tweaking on them to make sure that they fit in between the frame rails. And I have about 8 of them in total. I think 3 of them I'm going to use on this frame, and then 5 on the frame that I made in the other video. Now, what I've done to set this up is I squared it off here, clamped it down, and on this side, because I have a little bit of a ledge either way, I couldn't just clamp it down, and I should get myself some wider jaw clamps. But what I resorted to is, one is I put another piece here so that it would be square, so it's actually pushing up on that, and it's clamped down here. And then this was going up a little bit, so I wanted to make it sure that it was flat down to the MDF. And so I got this giant block of steel that its weight is enough to push it down. So now that I have the first one set, I'll go and tack it in and then get the second one set, and then I'll come back and walk you through that one. I have the first temporary cross member welded up on both sides. I let it cool down before I disconnected anything. And then I set up the second one, and this I want it to be higher. The next one will go back down low. And since I have the frame rails in position, I didn't want to undo it, flip it around, try to measure it out. Maybe it's gonna bow a little bit because the heat's gonna, on this one's gonna pull it in this way. So I'd rather get it welded as it's in place right now. And then with the third one, it's okay if I flip it over. Actually, I'm gonna have to turn around because I'll just be in the air, and it makes more sense if I turn it 180 degrees so it's on the MDF. So what I have here are 1, 2, 3 blocks. They go by 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch. So it's set to the side that's 2 inches. Since this is a 3x2 and this is a 1 inch, so 2 inches, and then that 1 inch will bring it up so then it's flush. I did the same on this side, but similarly, because I don't have a clamp with a large enough throat, I'm just using this big hunk of cube of steel just to hold it into place. Now, ideally, I'd like a clamp so it's not moving in and out, but I'm kind of hoping with my fingers crossed that this will be enough to hold it in place. And what I'll do first is I'll weld it from the top, let it cool down a little bit before I do the sides. That way it won't have an ability to shrink and move. So I'll get both sides welded up and then move to the third. I now have the 3 cross members tacked in, and my next step is to get the existing frame ready to connect the new frame to it. What you see me doing here is welding in some flat bar underneath to give it a ledge that I can rest the new frame on while I get everything level. So what you just saw is me put a couple of tacks to mate for the first time the new frame to the old frame. Now, this is just to hold it in position while I do some extra checks. What I did here is make sure that everything was square. I have the laser level. It is centered to this temporary cross member, which is tied to the old frame. The front bed mount cross member, it's centered there. I also put a mark behind the camera to give me a guide on the wall where it should be. And then I moved the frame in position. I have jack stands on the back. And in the front, what I had to do, because I didn't have enough jack stands, is I ended up using 1x1 that I clamped on the old frame and then clamped on the new frame to bring it up. Made sure everything was level, and I found driver's side to passenger side was off about 0.1 degree. And it really wasn't much, and it's probably still going to be okay, but I wanted to see if I could get that right to dead zero. So I got some 20 gauge steel and shimmed it underneath the 1x1 and the new frame, and that did it. Everything leveled up to be 0 degrees. So what I want to be able to do is measure crosswise, but this 1x1's in the way, which is why I did a couple of tacks just to hold it in position. It will be a little bit delicate. Then that'll allow me to take off the 1x1, do some checks, make sure everything's square, and then I can clamp it back on and do a bit more permanent weld. Well, I went ahead and measured the frame diagonally, so from the passenger side of the new frame to a mark that I had put before on the old frame, and did the opposite. I'm out about a 1/16 of an inch, which means I'd have to move everything by 1/32 of an inch just to get into position. And the time and effort to do that, I don't think it's worth it. As I'm figuring out how I'm going to fully weld the old frame with the new frame, a couple things I want to point out. One here is there's quite a bit of a step, and it's the same on both sides. I measured it. It's exactly something like 7/32. And you'll see there's kind of like an inherent crack that's in between. So the inside piece, or the piece closest to the new frame, is part of the 3x3 square tubing that was in there before. This outside piece is the original OEM 1/8 inch frame. And I had planned on having the outside of the new frame line up with this crack, basically be in line with this 3x3. But obviously my measurements were off. And to redo everything to make it work, I don't think it's worth it. So I think the way I'm going to go about it is I'll do a fillet weld here, but then I'll get some 1/8 inch and tie it in. So basically cover this part, figure out a way to step it down, and then tie it to the new frame. I start off with beveling the areas that the old frame and the new frame will be connected, and then I go ahead and weld it up. I use the MIG welder because it is more forgiving if the material isn't 100% clean. So I was experimenting a little bit with 1/8 inch steel to figure out how I could do the small bend. Now it's not perfect, but I think it will work. I used some scrap steel that I had, and I think what I'm going to do now is clean it up, cut it down to size, do another check, and if it looks good, then I'll take you through the process of how I built it. Now with the piece all cleaned up, this is roughly what it would look like, and I think it's going to work. I am thinking about drilling a couple of holes on either side to do plug welds. Before that, I will make the driver's side and I'll take you through that. So the way I made this is I added 2 bends. So here's a new piece of 1/8 inch, and I marked where I want the bends to be. The distance between the lines is about 3/8 of an inch. And what I'll do first is set it to one of the lines and hit it with a hammer to about 30 degrees, then flip it around and hit it back. It won't be quite 30 degrees. I might have to do it a couple of times, but it seemed to work. I also made it a little bit longer because although I marked where I want the bends to be, the bend might actually happen a little bit above or below depending on how it sits in the vise. That way, once I actually have it to the shape that I want, I could trim it to fit. And I have this mallet, which will give the initial blows. Then I might switch to the ball part of this hammer once I flip it around. I'll show you. The ball just to try to keep that angle there that's going to be in the middle of the piece. So not quite there. So I'll basically do the process again. Oh yeah, there we go. Perfect. I could drill some holes for some plug welds. I'm now set up to drill out the holes, same process as in my other video, so I'll move this along pretty quickly. I start off with a pilot hole, and since I want to do full plug welds, I do 4 of them. I then move on to a step drill, which I enlarge the holes up to 1/2 inch. And again, have to do this 4 times. So the holes drilled out for the first part, and I'm just going to do the second now. Same process. With the braces ready, I sand down the area to get rid of all the rust and grime, and then I prep the area with some weld-through primer. Once that's done, I tack the braces in place and then lock them in with plug weld. And then wrap it up with a weld around the border. And the outside braces are done. I still have to weld the bottom, which I'll do when I flip the frame over. And I still have to address the inside bracing, which will happen at a later time. Next, I focus on the rear part of the frame where I make sure everything's parallel and have the cross bracing starting first on the rails that move upwards to the axle hump. Once I know that everything is parallel and square, I tack them in. Things seem to be going smoothly until I moved on to the midsection of the axle hump. Well, I messed up. I'm quite frustrated with myself right now, and the reason for that is yesterday I was squaring up the new frame rails and things weren't lining up. When I put them on top of each other, I realized why. And it will mean that I have to redo some of it. So I'll show you where it's misaligned. The most dramatic part is the tail end of the frame. you can see it comes off here, and let me get a good angle, yeah, maybe over top, that they are definitely not parallel with each other. That's aligned with each other. This one's aligned. They are, you know, touching as close as you can. And then you look over here, they're out of position quite significantly. The other part that is out is where it comes from the hump down to the parallel tubing that I had installed in the previous scene. And you can see that there's a gap, it grows, so it's not parallel. And when I take some measurements, these two are not quite aligned. It's about 0.2 to 0.3 degrees off. And so now I'm trying to decide, is it worth living with that and looking to bring these together? So you put a few pressure, you could bring it down. So it's possibly that I can get this close with enough clamping force, weld it. It does mean it's going to be under tension the whole time, and it's going to want to separate. So I have to make sure that I have the right cross members lined up so it could withstand that force. Not quite convinced at that yet, so I have some thinking to do. So for sure, coming back to the bottom end, these two pieces I have to remove. I checked the angles, they're both off. One is closer than the other, but at this point in time it makes sense to remove both. And then I need to come back and decide what to do here. The first part pains me the most because I have to cut off the bracing at the joints. These are some of the better welds I've ever done, and I need to get rid of them. Once the braces are off, I clean up the area and start to slice the welds to separate the rear bar from the rest of the frame rail. Once the rear bars are cut off, I line the remaining part of the frame rails up, and I use a laser level to make sure that the ends of the bars are the same. Previously in the episode, I was mentioning that I had problems clamping down some of the rails due to the size of the MDF. Since I am already going backwards and I want to make sure I don't mess things up in the future, I go out and cut down the MDF so I would be able to properly clamp both rails on both sides. I start off in the middle where the highest point of the frame is, since this is where I'm going to locate the axle with. This is the critical piece to make sure it's square. And as always, once everything is squared and in place, I tack it in. Afterwards, I move on to the portion that moves down towards the back. And when that's all squared up, I tack that in place. I then move on to the part where I started, which is the rails that will connect to the midsection, and they're really far apart. And I don't have a clamp that wide, so I decide to buy a pipe clamp, which allows me to bring those rails in parallel and get the bracing in so it doesn't spring back. Finally, the rear frame rails are parallel. I need to mark where the mid frame and the rear frame meet so I can cut off the excess material. So I line up the rear frame as best I could next to the mid frame. Make sure everything's level, and then with the razor blade, I mark off where they meet. With it marked, I take the rear frame off, set it on the table, cut off the excess material, and I dress it to be welded later on. I then bring the rear part of the frame back and bring it into position, making sure that it's all level and aligned centrally with a laser level. All right, I'm really excited. I have most of the back half of the frame in place. Everything's level, everything's in position. There is one thing that is a little bit out that I think I could deal with a little bit later, which is these rails. And earlier on in the video, these rails were off and I was trying to decide if I would keep them or if I would cut them off and redo that. I decided to keep it. I think I could still make it work. So you could kind of see it's off a bit. It's hanging over top and over. Same with the other side. And you also see that I have a tack there. I've done it as well on the other side. That's just to hold the frame in place. So if I kick it by accident, it's not going to get out of shape. And I will eventually cut off these welds just to hold it in. My next step is to reinforce the back so it does not move. Because if I try to adjust the front here, that's going to kick out everything in the back, and there's nothing holding the back right now. It's just on these stands. Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking of how I'm going to straighten out these two frame rails. When I put this back section in place, I originally had clamped the frame rails to be aligned with the parallel midsection of the frame. And I struggled because the back section was always off from centered. Even though it was squared, it was off from centered enough, about a quarter of an inch, so it was bothering me. And then I realized, well, these front bars might not be parallel with the back section, and therefore I focused on getting this section, which will help locate the axle, aligned in the position that I want, and then I would dress the front afterwards. I then braced up this back section so it won't move. And my original thought was to then force these front rails to be in position. This side's kicked inwards about 1/16 of an inch. This side's kicked outwards about 1/8 of an inch. The problem about putting pressure to move it in is that even though I weld it, as soon as I cut off this back bracing, this back section is going to kick back to where it was, being that quarter of an inch off. So the way I'm thinking of going about it is I need to be able to move this without introducing some strain. And I'll do that by cutting the top, the side, and the bottom of this weld on both sides. Move this one out and this one inwards. That way it could be in position in a relaxed state, and when I go to cut off the cross members in the back, it won't move the back section. So that's what I'm going to focus on next. Using a cutoff wheel and an angle grinder, along with a hacksaw and lots of blows of the hammer, I was able to remove the cross members. And it moved quite a bit. You can see here the gap now. On this side, which was turned more inwards before, it is now sticking out slightly. And I might be able to live with that. But on the other side, I'll still have to do some work because it is now moved out quite a bit. So the next step is to do some cutting of weld, which I don't really want to because I like the way they look, but I think it's best to do that to get everything aligned. Since I'm okay with the passenger side, I add a few tacks to make sure it doesn't move. Then I cut off the welds, which allows me to pull in the driver's side frame rail. I have to say this worked better than expected. After I had the relief cuts, I took the pipe clamp and moved this rail inwards, and I swung it in more so that when it came back, it rested pretty close to be parallel to here, but it was still pointed outwards, maybe a 16th. But I was okay with that because on the other side, it is out a little bit. I left it just because I didn't want to do more rework than I really needed to. Then I remembered, well, hey, the reason I came into this situation is because weld shrinks and moves things. So I decided that I would tack weld here first. I got the weld up where I cut, and just that tack, or these two tacks, and the shrinkage there moved this enough to be in line with this bar. And so while it's rested without any pressure on the bar, it's sitting parallel, which is amazing. And you can see how far I came in from that previous tack that I had there. So amazing, better than I expected. So really happy about that. Now it's time to complete the rear section of the frame. Since at the rear, I'm going to be placing a bar across, I wanted to cut them at a 45-degree angle. So I marked it off and brought out the trusty chop saw that I haven't used in almost a decade. After I plug it in to get it going, I realized why I stopped using it. It would always trip a breaker. So I went back to the trusty angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. I then square everything up, and as always, tack weld it in. I'm back to TIG welding. Now, my table's not big enough, which is why I use that MDF to set everything before. And I was comfortable using the MDF when I was just tack welding, because I'm not putting that much heat for that long. But TIG welding, it's going to put in quite a bit of heat, and I just don't want the piece to be on MDF while I'm doing that. The only concern I have is, with my previous experience in the previous videos, is that even after clamping things down, things moved. So what I'm doing here is clamping it as best as I can, knowing that some of the piece is going to be off the table. And I'm going to systematically approach each weld one at a time. And so my thought is to actually start with some hard ones, which will be the inside corner. So it's going to be a vertical weld. And by doing that, it's going, when it shrinks, it's going to want to bring this piece inwards, which is going to be stopped by this bar that's already tacked in and is being held. If it tries to put pressure on this bar, it's held in twice. And again, this back bar is held in twice. So I think that's a good place to start. And then I'll figure out, try to, guess where the weld's going to want to move, and make sure that everything is clamped down to minimize that movement. So fingers crossed that I come out of this with it still fairly square and flat, and then I could bring this onto the rest of the frame. So I start off with the inside and outside corners, and then I weld across the top. The next step is to flip it over, brace it, and weld the bottom. Accept. Well, I messed up. Well, it didn't stay flat. So I cut the welds, and using MDF this time, I made sure everything was flat and square. I used some filler rod to fill in the gaps from the cutoff wheel and got it all welded up again. Do you know what the worst thing is about fixing mistakes? So when you cut through a nice looking weld and the next weld is not nearly as good, and I've also introduced some porosity, as you can see from the eruptions here. But if I grind that down, it'll be full of holes. And on the other side, I started hearing it, stopped welding, and I could see it. So I'm not gonna worry about it too much right now. I would rather get this piece on the truck and touch it up afterwards. So here's my current challenge. I believe I'm level, squared up. And when I measure corner here, back down to here, and on the opposite side, it's the same. Now, when I look at how it aligns with the frame itself, it is slightly off, but it's slightly off on both sides the same amount, where it's slightly inwards a little bit. But when I go from a laser level perspective, I'm off by 1/8 of an inch. Now, when I align it with the laser level, this side creates such a gap and it just doesn't make sense. Now it looks fairly close and it'd be weldable where it is. So I'm thinking I'm just going to leave it as is, get some tack welds on, and if it is slightly out by 1/8 of an inch, I can make adjustments with the bed and other things so it's not quite off. The good thing is that this part is straight and aligned, and this is where it's going to locate the axle and forward. So anything in the back, it's as long as I can adjust the bed to be square, it'll be fine. Now that was a challenge, and there are two components of this build that are giving me the most anxiety. The first is rebuilding the frame, and the second will be the rear suspension. So I knew this was going to be difficult, but it far exceeded my expectations on the level of difficulty to get it to where it is now. But I am happy. I'm happy with how it turned out. It's not perfect. It's off slightly in a couple of spots, but I know it's going to work. I also know it's not done yet. I still need to brace this back section so I could fully weld. There's some welding I still need to do up front. I still need to get the cat mounts back into position. So still a little bit of little things before I could say the frame is done. I'll save that for the next video. I do appreciate everybody that's watched and that has watched the series so far. If you have any questions, comments, please share. Any suggestions of how I can improve. I want to make these videos better, so I appreciate any feedback that you can provide. Thanks for watching.